Welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast with your host, Buck Fantastic.
Girl Scout cookies.
Imagine living in a place where electric and water is rationed, and home demolitions and evictions are the norm. Imagine a bunch of delusional illegal immigrants jumping or degrading you for being on what they refer to as their land. Imagine having your right to travel severely restricted. Imagine getting shot at or bombed for rebelling against these social injustices. What I just described is what life is like for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. With 2 Palestinian journalists being shot and killed by the Israeli Defense Forces within the past 3 weeks, I thought that a giant spotlight needed shined on the occupation of Palestine. After all, the U.S. government gives $3.8 billion in foreign aid to the government of Israel's military annually. Our taxpayer dollars is essentially being used to keep Palestinians whipped into submission and in line, or they get shot or bombed. On this episode of the Mothman the Bible Belt podcast, I have Mondoweis founder, senior editor, and journalist Philip Weiss. Mondoweis is an online news and analysis publication aimed at bringing the Palestinian perspective of the occupation to the United States. Weiss is going to break down the occupation, Zionism, the Israel lobby, and Palestinian life under Israeli apartheid. We're also going to discuss journalists being murdered by the Israeli government. Join me, your host, Buck Fantastic, for another exciting episode of the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast, because the government of Israel ethnically cleansing Palestinians at U.S. taxpayer expense is not cool. It's demented, and it's got to stop. Phil, how would you describe your online publication, Mondoweis, in a nutshell?
I'd say it's a journalistic advocacy effort to bring the Palestinian cause and an understanding of it to the United States.
For my listeners living under a rock, what's going on with Israel and Palestine? What's fueling the so-called conflict?
In the land of Palestine, or what Zionists call the land of Israel, between the river Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, there are roughly similar numbers of Palestinians and Jews, about 6 or 7 million of each. And for the last 74 years, the Jews have had a state there. Israel has been a state recognized by the world. At the same time that state was created, the world promised the Palestinians that they would get a state, and that promise has never been fulfilled. And so between the river and the sea, one people has supremacy, the Jews of Israel. And they've been taking more and more of the land that had been assigned to Palestinians for their state and frustrating all efforts for Palestinians to get a state. And so most of those 7 million Palestinians either have no rights at all or are second-class citizens inside the state of Israel. That is fueling the conflict. Inequality is fueling the conflict.
What has the occupation done for the 2 Palestinian territories?
What has it done to them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there actually, there's more than 2 in the sense that the Golan Heights are also occupied by Israel.
That's Syria's. Like Syria
Yeah,
used to end, right?
yes. And Jordan used to have the sovereignty over the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which Israel got in 1967. The occupation has sought to divide the Palestinian communities and say there's one group of Palestinians in Israel, there's another group in the West Bank, there's a third group in East Jerusalem, there's a fourth group in Gaza, under Hamas, and all of you are different groups of people. You are atomized and shattered and disconnected. And Palestinians have resisted that effort to fragment their sort of national unity, if you will.
How many illegal settlements exist in the West Bank currently?
I don't know. I guess it's not a number I should know. It is a number I should know. I guess that there are around between 50 and 70. Some of them are very small. Some of them are illegal outposts and shepherd stations created on Palestinian land. The number that I keep better track of is how many illegal settlers there are, almost all of them Jewish, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And that's around 750,000. So around 500,000 are in the West Bank, in settlements around the West Bank. And then another 250 roughly are in East Jerusalem.
And are these
Thousand.
settlers displacing the Palestinians?
In many cases, they have displaced the Palestinians, yes, or yes, the government policy is to displace Palestinians in many areas of the West Bank. And what you see over the course of uh, 50 years of this project is that Palestinian life has been pushed out of large areas of the West Bank and even of the largest one of the largest West Bank cities, Hebron. They've been pushed out of the areas in which they lived in Hebron to make way for Jewish settlers. So everywhere the settlers have gone, even when they've taken farmland where people aren't living on as such, or hilltops, they have um, cut off the Palestinian way of life and reduced and pushed Palestinians out of their homes too.
This week, the Israeli government began bulldozing Palestinian homes in the Masafer Yada villages of the West Bank. Thousands of Palestinians have lived there for decades. The Israeli government wants to use the land as a military training zone. How is this legal?
Well, none of it's legal, but Israel has a policy of creating what it calls facts on the ground. And just as any powerful uh, society or country or nation has demonstrated throughout history, when a country acts, when people act, might is often right, and facts on the ground is, or might is not, if not right, might creates this kind of quote unquote historical legitimacy. And um, Israel is a settler colonial state. And it's created more and more colonies and attracted immigrants to settle on Palestinian land. And these acts are illegal, and the world often condemns them through the UN, but there's no action is ever taken, largely due to the influence of the United States at the UN and in other world fora. So there's simply no enforcement of the law in these cases. In this case that you mentioned, a few dozen Democratic Congress people have objected and written angry letters to the State Department about the ethnic cleansing, but which is a sort of a high watermark. Usually it's only a dozen or two. So here you have, I think, something on the order of 70 or 80 who are objecting. But again, they're a minority, and the State Department, while making the right noises, will do absolutely nothing. It will show lip service, but do nothing as it plans Joe Biden's trip to Israel later this month.
What will happen to the people of Musafer Yarder?
Thank you. Yeah, good question. You know, um, many of the people in Masaferyata, and again, I don't know that I'm pronouncing it the correct way, but many of those people are already been displaced before. They're living in tents. Their houses have been demolished before. They will be forced into sort of more urban Palestinian areas in the West Bank. That is the plan, to sort of concentrate Palestinian life in certain areas and clear that land for the use by the Jewish state.
Why do you think Americans are all crickets over Israel demolishing Palestinian homes and shooting or bombing the Palestinians when they rebel, but are all outraged over Russia invading and bombing Ukraine?
Well, it's a great question. Excuse me. I do have COVID. I'm getting over COVID. It's a good question. The I mean, I would turn it back on you in the sense that you're paying attention to this in West Virginia, right?
Yep.
Okay.
One of
Why are you,
few.
what's that?
One of few.
Okay. So why are you paying attention to it? And how long have you been paying attention to it? And does the fact that you're paying attention to it mean that more and more Americans are paying attention to it, which I would say is the case? Younger people generally on the Democratic side are beginning to care as much about Palestine as they care about Israel, according to surveys, even more about Palestine than Israel. So perhaps those crickets will fade in time. As to the Ukraine, I mean, obviously you have the big Democrat, both parties, loving the idea of a Cold War with Russia, and obviously to some degree concerned with human rights and violations and refugees and war crimes in the Ukraine.
I've just been paying attention since I went to a pro Palestinian rally in 2009. Then 2011, there was a rally for Gaza I went to,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when and I'm not even a Democrat anymore. I'm a left-leaning independent. So,
Okay.
but I know that, in my opinion, Jewish Zionism feeds Christian Zionism, which in turn is creating this whole illusion that Armageddon's breaking out in
Mm-hmm.
the Holy Land, and
Mm-hmm.
that's feeding the fanatics in our country and keeping them
Mm-hmm.
constantly
Mm-hmm.
hung up on divisive social issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's like human rights over there and human rights here. I mean, both are taking hitting because of the fanaticism from the two different strains of Zionism that's being
Interesting.
fed. And
Yeah, I like your analysis. Yeah, I'm more concerned with Jewish Zionism because I'm Jewish, and I feel it is that I know it personally. I don't know the Christian Zionism personally. I mean, I didn't grow up with it, and so it's my particular, that's my cross to bear. Is Jewish Zionism. So I have a responsibility as a journalist to examine what Jews are doing to create these human rights atrocities and, yeah, feed the fanaticism uh, here.
were you a Zionist in your younger years?
I can't say I was. No, not really. I mean, I grew up in a family that was a little bit eccentric, wasn't really part of the Jewish community. But when I got bar mitzvahed, I grew up in Baltimore. When I got bar mitzvahed, they gave me Zionist texts, but I didn't really absorb them. We weren't, had we been members of the Jewish community, we had lots of Jewish friends. We were members of the community, but had we been members of the organized Jewish community, I surely would have become a Zionist or been more indoctrinated, because it was doctrine in the 60s and 70s as I was growing up inside the Jewish community to support Israel. Still is doctrine in the organized Jewish community, but it really is promulgated, propagated, disseminated inside, sort of official Jewish spaces, so that when the 6-Day War happened, as Israel calls it, in 1967, my best friend came up to me in elementary school and said, "Did you hear the Israeli jets destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the tarmac in Cairo? Wow, isn't that great news?" Now I hadn't followed that news. Didn't care. I was 11 years old, whatever. But it's a measure of how caught up in Israel chauvinism, Israel's militarism, the American Jewish community was. This is a liberal Jewish community in Baltimore that was opposing the Vietnam War vehemently and yet was supporting Israel's wars against Palestinians and Arabs.
On May 11th, Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was reporting on the Israeli Defense Force home raids in the West Bank for Al Jazeera when she was shot and killed by the IDF. Zionist political organizations were quick to come to the Israeli government's aid. AIPAC released the following statement via Twitter the following day. It is an outrage that the Palestinian Authority refuses to share evidence into the death of Shireen Abu Akleh. Blaming Israel before a thorough, objective investigation is pure propaganda. U.S. leaders must condemn this and demand the Palestinians cooperate to reveal the truth. This is commonplace with AIPAC, right?
Yes, it is. It's commonplace among Israel lobby organizations, including right-wing ones. You're good. You're a good radio reader, man. And that was well told. Yeah, it's really common. And many other organizations in the center and right Israel lobby made similar statements. Now, some liberal Zionist organizations, which also support giving endless money to Israel from the United States and support Zionism, some of them made critical statements and said there has to be an independent investigation of this killing by the United States or international organizations. But yeah, I mean, this is part of the tragedy that you have these large organizations inside the Jewish community who a wonderful journalist is slain at 51, shot by a sniper, almost certainly an Israeli. More and more evidence has demonstrated that it really was an Israeli, but sniper. But at the time, the eyewitnesses on the ground in the Jenin said, that's who shot her. Those snipers 500 feet down the road there, and is by the Israeli jeeps. And yet those eyewitnesses were ignored by these American Jewish organizations. They called them, as you just quoted, propaganda. Here you have someone, an atrocity of the highest order, the killing of a journalist, something that animated the Congress when Saudi Arabia killed Jamal Khashoggi. And here's a situation in which even CNN has said that the Israeli sniper targeted Shireen Abu Akleh, and these American Jewish organizations have nothing to say except blame the Palestinians.
Yeah, 60 House Democrats wrote a letter addressed to the State Department and FBI requesting an independent investigation to Shireen Abu Akleh's death at the hands of the IDF. Do you really think that it's going to fall on deaf ears?
I don't, but I'm a very hopeful person. So I tend to be optimistic about these things. But I would point out that, so to sound the optimistic note, it is true that many media organizations are not letting the death of Shireen Abu Akleh disappear. The New York Times has run a good op-ed on the subject by Diana Butu. The CNN and the AP have both investigated the killing and showing that an Israeli sniper almost certainly did it. Overwhelming evidence that an Israeli sniper did it. And as you point out, these 57 congressmen are demanding an investigation. Even liberal Zionist organizations demand an investigation. The State Department is feeling the heat. The State Department makes continual statements about we are calling Israel to conduct a thorough investigation quickly. Now, the preposterous element of the State Department's statements and of Anthony Blinken's comments too is the idea that Israel would conduct a thorough and fair investigation. It won't do that. And MSNBC itself did very powerful reporting the other night when Rafe Sanchez in Jerusalem said that he had asked Israel about the killing of the Gaza journalist Yasser Murtaha 4 years ago in 2018. He was shot by an Israeli sniper, also wearing a press flak vest as Shireen Abu Akleh was, also wearing a blue helmet, clearly identified as press, was shot by a sniper. And there was international outrage then. And Rafe Sanchez asked, well, Israel, what happened with your investigation? And it said, oh, well, we did not. We did not pursue the matter. It was not seen as a violation of our rules of order or rules of engagement, whatever. Israel covered up that killing of this young journalist, Yasser Murtaha. And so the expectation by the State Department that it's going to do a thorough and fair investigation now is absurd. And that now's the time for the United States to demand that it see the evidence, or the FBI see the evidence, or the State Department, some independent agencies, international agencies, should be conducting an investigation of this atrocity.
According to Al Jazeera, at least 45 journalists have been killed by Israeli forces since 2000, and 2 days ago, another Palestinian journalist, Ghufran Harun Warasneh, was shot by the IDF near the Al Arub refugee camp.
Yes.
2 Palestinians were murdered, including her, during the raids in Jenin and Bethlehem.
Yeah,
Who's to blame?
The killings don't end.
Yeah, I mean, these are international crimes. I mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
they're war crimes. I mean,
Yes. Yes.
but yet no one's getting punished for them.
That's true. And when you say who's to blame, I would say that the occupation is to blame in these cases, because um, Zionism goes beyond the occupation, and Israel's violations of international law are not strictly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But in the cases that you mentioned, you have, as you indicated earlier in this discussion, ongoing illegal settlement on a racist basis, Jews taking Palestinian land, a system that has been called apartheid by the leading human rights organizations of the world, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, both in the last year.
And
So,
B'Tselem.
and B'Tselem in Israel, yes, Al Haq in Palestine. So you have the rules of under an apartheid system. Uh, there are settlers, illegal settlers, taking Palestinians' land, moving them off their land. People are going to resist that. I mean, imagine. I always tell people when I talk about this in the United States. Imagine if someone forced me out of my house and took over the land on some religious basis and said that they'd seen God here 3,000 years ago or whatever. I mean, I can tell you that and my neighbors too, if they experience, I know that we'd be up in the hills around here with guns. I just know that that's what would happen. I know American history well enough. I know human history well enough to know that that it fosters violent resistance. So when I think that, and then the Israeli occupying forces have to be more and more brutal, and that's what they have been demonstrating over the last few weeks.
The Palestinian population is growing. You hear about Palestinians having their building permits rejected for Area C. Why is it so difficult for Palestinians to get a building permit from the Israeli government to build homes when you know their population is growing?
Well, because Israel's not a democracy. Israel's an apartheid system. Now, if Israel were a democracy, presumably every citizen or everyone who's subject to rule would have an equal right to, building permits. They could all walk down to town hall and apply for a permit, like we do here, and get it or not get it based on the code. Um, but to answer your question, I think most directly, the reason that they're not getting building permits is that in 4 years ago, Israel passed a law called the nation state law. And this says that Jews have higher rights in Palestine and Israel, in both these lands, than Palestinians do. It says it explicitly. And in fact, the passage of that law 4 years ago is why Human Rights Watch finally said, after years of people saying, are you going to look into apartheid? Are you going to look into apartheid? Human Rights Watch said we had to do it at this point. Israel explicitly was calling itself the Jewish state and saying explicitly in that law, they say Jews have a higher right, have an exclusive right of self-determination in the land of Israel. The exclusive right of self-determination. It's like saying that Christians have the exclusive right of self-determination in the United States. What does self-determination mean? It means basic sort of rights and expressions of citizenship, like higher language rights and higher rights of land. So the state, the parliament has said Jews have a higher right to land than Palestinians. And this law, which was so upsetting to liberal Zionists in the United States who say Israel has a declaration of independence, says all people are equal. This law has never been, it's come under a lot of pressure from people who want to see a good Israel. Israel has never retracted it, will never retract it, has doubled down on it, and the legislature just gets more right wing. So that's really the other cause that I continually go to is the role of the Jewish Israel lobby in the United States, which refuses to put pressure on Israel and resists all efforts by the United States government to put pressure on Israel. And if
Why
I
do you
might just go on for another second here, the most, the strongest U.S. objection that has occurred to Israeli settlements, Israeli expansion, Israeli violations of law, of international law, the strongest objection took place when Barack Obama was a lame duck in December of 2016. The last few weeks of his presidency, he allowed a Security Council resolution to go through calling the settlements a flagrant violation of international law. The United States abstained on that, didn't even support it, but it allowed it to go through. And Donald Trump, who was president-elect, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, did all they could with the Russians to try. They went to the Russians to try to veto that Security Council resolution. That is the one exception I can even point to in U.S. policy in recent years, and it was under a lame duck presidency.
Why do you think many evangelical Christians blindly support the government of Israel when you hear stories coming out of the West Bank showing Israeli settlers going after Palestinian Christians and Christian churches the way some have done Palestinian Muslims and mosques? Israel has demolished its fair share of Palestinian Christian homes as it has Palestinian Muslim homes, haven't they?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that's a rhetorical question. I think that you're stating the problem in the question, and you sort of, well, I don't know that you know the answer. I don't know the answer.
Well, I
I
don't know. I
sort
mean,
yeah,
the thing is,
yeah,
you hear about the Israeli settlers
yeah,
going after Muslim
yeah, of
Palestinians,
course. Yeah, it's
but
all
they
true.
also go after Christians as
Yeah,
well
yeah,
in Palestine.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, I think I'm when I say rhetorical question, I think you're making a good argument there, and I wish you were, had a bigger loudspeaker on it. I don't know the answer to your question. I do know that, I mean, obviously, um, they're religious, uh, there are various religious stories that people tell themselves about the Jewish return to the land of Israel, presaging the apocalypse. And I think under certain Christian theory, it's necessary for there to be an ingathering of Jews in the ancient land of Israel in order for, uh, the kingdom of God on earth to take place with Jesus' return. I'm not sure. I think the second coming is predicated on first the Jews regathering. But I regard that all as malarkey, both on the Jewish side, the Muslim side, the Christian side. I'm not a good believer of those old stories, but I would say that that there's certainly a strong political support for that in the right-wing Christian community in the United States. I'd also say that the trends that I spoke of earlier, in which young people and Democrats are beginning to challenge American support from Israel, those trends are true among evangelical young people too. And young Christians, I think, are getting a clue about this. They're on social media. They're seeing some of these broadcasts. They're not dumb, and they're responding as they should. And I think they'll be part of this movement that is so important in the United States for Palestinian human rights.
In the past few years, there's been a huge discussion about Zionism. Many people around the globe view it as a racist ideology, except for the US, Canada, and the UK. How would you define Zionism, and do you think it's inciting global anti Semitism?
I would define Zionism as a desire, as activism and desire, elements of an ideology, in other words, to create a political state for Jews, of Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land. So it's a movement that has existed in the West in a small or large way for the last 150 years, especially as the persecution of Jews became more intense in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe as well. So a key moment in the history of Zionism was in 1896 when Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, an Austrian journalist, Hungarian Austrian journalist, was attending the Dreyfus trial in Paris and heard people saying death to the Jews in the streets of Paris and said, we need a place to go as Jews. We're not safe here. Now, today, that was 1896. That's some of the roots of Zionism. Today, the full expression of Zionism is young Jews chanting in the streets of Jerusalem, death to Arabs. That is the flag march through Jerusalem that thousands and thousands of Jews attended. Many Palestinians were beaten up, assaulted, sprayed with pepper, rocks thrown at them. There were clashes, but overwhelmingly Palestinians were arrested, and none of the people who chanted these slogans, death to Arabs, Shireen is dead, they weren't arrested. And
It's
so that,
disturbing.
I'm sorry?
It's disturbing.
It's very disturbing. So that is what Zionism is today. Zionism began as a quote unquote liberation movement for Jews in Europe, and its full realization has been the subjugation and discrimination and dehumanization of Palestinians. Now, it's also, people can say, well, you're leaving out all the things Zionism has done, all its successes of, and you can certainly point to a lot of economic um, growth in the land of the state of Israel that Zionism has pushed and created, but it's all been at a terrible cost.
Do you think it's inciting global anti Semitism?
I guess I do think so. I think that, I think that the efforts by the organized Jewish community around the world and in the countries that you mentioned, especially the UK, Canada, United States, and Australia, efforts in those countries to assert that Jews support Zionism, all the major Jewish organizations support Zionism. Indeed, Zionism is a Jewish expression. Zionism, to be Jewish, is to be Zionist. All these efforts are dangerous to Jews, and because they are associating Jews, all Jews, including me, with this place that I find to be hateful in its policies, an apartheid state. So that argument is a difficult argument to make, but certainly lately Sylvain Chappelle, this French journalist, has made it. Israel is dangerous to Jews. Hannah Arendt, the great German American intellectual, made it in the 1940s. As Israel becomes an embattled Spartan state, she said, it will call on Jews around the world to support it, and this could be dangerous to Jews. The sociologist, Harvard sociologist Nathan Glazer, he made this argument many years ago that Jewish support for Israel would cause us to be endangered. And more recently, Tony Klug at J Street has made this argument. What I'm saying is that many Jewish intellectuals have pointed out the dangers of forcing Jews or compelling Jews to support Israel and stand up for Israel. It's identifying Jews with a really hateful brand.
How are U.S. Zionist political organizations impacting U.S. policy regarding the occupation?
I think that the occupation is an American Jewish achievement because for the last 50 years, American Jewish organizations have forced American politicians to stand by the occupation. So I'll give you two efforts by American politicians to counter the occupation. George Herbert Walker Bush in 1991 didn't want to give loan guarantees, $10 billion in loan guarantees to Israel for so it could build housing for Jews coming from the Soviet Union until Israel stopped the settlements. George H.W. Bush said this is gonna,
Wow.
You didn't know that?
I'm still learning.
That's fine. No, I'm not trying to accuse. I'm just, it's a landmark. So it's good.
It's a lot to take in, you
Okay,
know.
no, I'm not. Okay, so let me be a little bit explicit about this. So George H.W. Bush stood out there and said, I've got thousands of lobbyists coming up here telling me not to do this. I got to stop this. And he was called anti-Semitic for this because he was calling out the Israel lobby. And the Israel lobby worked against him in the coming election, the 1992 election. George Bush was a one-term president. And he and others have blamed his loss of a second term on the fact that he took on the Israel lobby. Bill Clinton ran to George Bush's right on settlements. He said, you can do anything you want in the occupied territories, in so many words. And even Tom Friedman of the New York Times has said the political lesson that came to George Bush the Younger, who became president in 2000, was never take on Israel, because my daddy lost his second term on that basis. The other politician whose opposition to settlements I want to bring to your attention was a young senator from Delaware named Joe Biden, who slammed the table in around 1981, I think it was. I forget how long he was in the Senate. It was in his first term. He slammed the table with a visiting Israeli prime minister and said, you've got to stop this settlement business. How are the Palestinians ever going to have a state? How are they ever going to get, you're taking over their land? And that incident, not only did Joe Biden live to regret that statement, his campaign staff denied that it had happened during the last election because Joe Biden had to please the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby is so powerful inside the Democratic Party. Joe Biden removed the language about occupation and settlements from the Democratic Party platform. Why did he do that? Because of the role of the Israel lobby and the support of right-wing Jewish Zionists, campaign support inside the Democratic Party. And that's why the United States has stood by for 50 years as Israel has gobbled up Palestinian land and shot Palestinian journalists dead.
That's why I'm not a Democrat anymore.
That's a good
I mean,
reason.
they won't take a hard stand on anything, and that's why we're a red state in West Virginia.
Okay.
I mean, they're very right wing in West Virginia.
Yes.
So
they come by it honestly, don't they? I mean, that's the way the people are, right?
In this state, most definitely.
Okay.
The American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, aka AIPAC,
yes,
is lobbying Congress and state legislatures to make it a crime for Americans to participate in the Boycotts, Divestments, and Sanctions movement.
Yes.
Last year, the West Virginia legislature passed anti-BDS bill, House Bill 2933, which created the Anti-Discrimination Against Israel Act. Yeah, West Virginia delegate Kayla Kessinger was the main sponsor. She was flown to Israel by an unnamed Christian Zionist organization. Only one policymaker, Delegate Barbara Evans Flashire, voted against the bill. Does this shock you coming from West Virginia?
No. Well, no, I mean, in fairness to West Virginia, y'all are not the only ones who are doing this. There are 28 states doing this type of legislation, and our governor in New York, excuse me, Andrew Cuomo, former governor, he signed an executive order making it, you know, uh, punishing those who take state funds or do business with the state, advocating for BDS. And in Texas, the law, resulted in a, a teacher, I think, losing employment or suing the state over this. So this is anti-free speech, of course. Boycott is a traditional way for people to express their views about uh, things that they find objectionable. In Alabama, the Montgomery bus boycott is credited in the 1950s uh, as a major part of the civil rights movement in this country to give black people a franchise or greater rights than they had under Jim Crow. So boycott's a great thing, and in this case, um, these 28 states or so are pursuing, blatantly anti-constitutional measures. I think it's good for the BDS movement because anybody who even looks at this for a second realizes this is nuts, and even the liberal Zionist organizations, which have called BDS an anti-Semitic movement. J Street has endorsed legislation. J Street is a big liberal Zionist organization in the Democratic Party. It has endorsed legislation that calls BDS anti-Semitic. Even they say, well, you shouldn't. People have a right to support BDS.
Isn't BDS similar to the campaign that was used to end apartheid in South Africa in the 90s?
Yes, it was. It's very similar to that. It's modeled on that to some degree. And yes, it is. And it will succeed the way that the one in South Africa succeeded.
Is APAC a human rights organization?
I wouldn't call it that. I don't think it calls itself a human rights organization. I think APAC would call itself a pro-Israel organization, and I call it a right-wing, you know, Zionist organization.
Hear this.
Yes.
APAC National Councilman Rabbi Victor Uriecki, he's the rabbi of B'nai Jacob here in Charleston. Rabbi Uriecki has infiltrated several so-called progressive groups in West Virginia. A few people have referred to him as a human rights advocate. He currently serves as the board president of the West Virginia Interfaith Refugee Ministry. In March, the ACLU of West Virginia awarded Uriecki with the ACLU Sid Bell Memorial Award at their annual Bill of Rights dinner. That was this year. Are these APAC National Council people propagandists for APAC spreading pro-Israel lunacy? The man rode the fence on Israel bombing the Gaza Strip last year and was silent on the bombings that took place in Gaza afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I perceive the man,
Yes.
as like a Trojan horse.
Yes. Well, I think that they are a Trojan horse in as much as they care most about one issue, and that issue is Israel, and they will use any sort of cloak they can to gain the support of American politicians. So, for instance, APAC has given money to certain pro-Trump Republicans, people who support the big lie, because they also support Israel. So APAC has dispensed with certain principles it has about democracy because these people support Israel. In a similar way, the ADL, which is an Anti-Defamation League, a big Israel supporting organization, it claims to care about Muslim human rights, religious freedom in the United States, and will even take some actions in favor of such measures and support religious freedom in legislation, say on Capitol Hill, and even do some good anti-racism work. At the same time, with its other hand, it's supporting Israel, and that's a core commitment and will never turn on Israel. So there's a contradiction and a hypocrisy that's true even of liberal Zionist organizations. Liberal Zionist organizations are very strongly in support of, or have been in support of, Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and yet They cannot support a similar movement inside Palestinian society, uh, which is BDS. Palestinians ask Americans to support BDS, and liberal Zionist organizations are sort of somewhat blind to the racism over there. They
Didn't
don't
the
acknowledge.
anti
I'm
didn't
sorry.
the Anti-Defamation League slam some Black Lives Matter activists a few years back for equating the lives of Black Americans with Palestinians?
Yes, it did. It did. Yeah, it regularly does that kind of thing. It says, yeah, it says that it seems to think that life is great for Palestinians in Israel and the West Bank and occupied territories. So they're all lying, and even the liberal Zionist organizations are lying about this in as much as they refuse to accept the apartheid label. You go over there, you walk around for 5 minutes, and you say, "Wow, I've only read about apartheid in the history books. I've seen a movie about it. This is apartheid." It's just plain as the nose on your face when you see it. When you see the Jewish settlers streaming through with their cars into the West Bank, and the Palestinians at cattle grates trying to get in and out of to Jerusalem, and so so the segregation is blatant, and it's on a Jewish Palestinian basis everywhere before your eyes, and liberal Zionists can't acknowledge that.
3 West Virginia mayors signed on to the American Jewish Committee's Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism letter, including Charleston Mayor Amy Goodwin. This organization decries criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic. Mayor Goodwin recently met with Rabbi Uriecki and Benjamin Krasna, the deputy head of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., to discuss economic opportunities with Israel and anti-Semitism. Should West Virginians be concerned about their elected leaders having such relationships with Israel and Zionist organizations?
Are you concerned about it?
Very. I
Okay.
mean, to me, it's like I haven't heard anything negative about Rabbi Uriecki, so I'm not slamming him on that count. But I don't understand why any self-respecting man of God would want to be involved in an organization that whitewashes people getting murdered and having their homes demolished. It
Yeah,
doesn't
I
make any
agree with you.
sense to me. It's
I
fucked
agree with
up.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I'm
It should
glad.
cause light bulbs to go off in people's heads
Yeah, I'm
as
with
to
you,
what these
man.
people's
I
real
think it's great.
intentions are.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's great what you're saying. Yeah, I think it's terrible. I mean, the thing is that it's getting politicized slowly. This stuff is becoming politicized. And, right now it's anti Semitic to raise these questions. But, you know, uh, Donald Trump, raises the question of how much we are spending in the Ukraine, the United States, and whether we should be spending that money at home. Now, those are his political values being expressed. And obviously, he has a perfect right to ask that question. Anyone has a perfect right to ask that question, where we spend our money. When you ask that question about Israel, why we're spending our money over there, giving all this money, and rather than here, you're accused of being an anti-Semite. So that, uh, or you're having a conspiracy theory, whatever it is. So normal political discourse is off limits when it comes to Israel because of this anti-Semitism fear. And we've got to break that down. That is what's happening right now, I believe, in American society. Jews have to give other people permission to discuss this. People are afraid to discuss this because they are afraid to be accused of being anti-Semitic. Being accused of anti-Semitism is a very serious charge. It can end a career. It's like being accused of racism, and people don't want that. I understand
Yeah.
that. I've been accused of anti-Semitism many times, but be that as it may, I'm Jewish, and therefore I have a kind of I'm perceived to have a more authority on this question than others, and so it's very important that Jews help break this hammerlock on the American discourse. I'm trying.
The Anti-Defamation League CEO Jonathan Greenblatt said
Mm-hmm.
that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, labeled Palestinian human rights groups as extremists,
Yes.
and equated critics of Israel to white supremacists.
Yeah. It's
The
crazy.
ADL doesn't take that full position, does it?
I think it does now. I think it says that this white nationalism that y'all are so concerned about, we're so concerned about in the United States, that's so virulent and dangerous. Uh, they said, well, anti-Zionism is just as bad. They've said that. Jonathan Greenblatt has said that. Now he has been mocked, scorned, and criticized by many liberal Jews over this. And happily, even the New Yorker magazine, which has been very supportive of Israel over the years, even the New Yorker found these comments to be absurd. You know, so he has been somewhat embarrassed about it, but he hasn't retreated over it. And this is a guy who gets interviewed as an expert on anti-Semitism on MSNBC and CNN. I haven't seen you on MSNBC or CNN lately, but Jonathan Greenblatt gets, and I haven't been on there either. No shade cast on you there, man.
Do
But
they not even go after like people like you from since you are a credible journalist, you're reporting on this at Mondoweiss.
yeah, I like to think so. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Did they go after me? What?
No, do like what do they not even go to you all like to have a perspective? Do any of these mainstream media outlets go after you all? I mean, it's
Very
rarely you
rarely.
see that you
Yeah.
people like you or people from Jewish Voice for Peace
Yes. It's very rare. It's very rare.
or the
Yeah.
Adela Project.
Yes. Yeah. You don't see them enough. Now that's going to change, but yes, we're marginalized, and then you see these right wing hacks, Zionist hacks on these shows all the time, including Michael Oren or Yulia Yofi today on WNYC, supporting the uh, United States getting more militarily involved in the Ukraine. Yeah, we're marginalized, but I think that's changing. I think that the fact that you see uh, Ayman Mohyeldin on MSNBC, that you see Mehdi Hassan on MSNBC, these are very important developments. Um, when you can see Arabs and Arab Americans on American television who don't share a piety about Zionism. They're just not indoctrinated in Zionism, as so many Jews are.
I've noticed in the aftermath of the IDF bombing the hell out of Gaza last year,
Yes.
more publications started reporting more on what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians compared to decades. I mean, there was a write up in the Charleston Gazette Mail about what's been going on over there, and I wrote an op-ed that they published in support of the Palestinians. I figured they would say we don't want to publish this shit,
Hmm.
but it got published. I mean, I just I just think that
That's great.
after they bombed the building that contained the AP and Al Jazeera
Yes.
last year,
Yes.
I think it opened the floodgates. Do you think that?
It's funny that you bring that up. Oh, I think it's great what you're doing. And I'll have to do a podcast with you sometime, Mondoweiss. But because you're good ears on the ground for us on this issue in the quote unquote heartland. You bring up an incident during the May 2021 onslaught of Israel on Gaza, where they warned people to leave this office building, and then they destroyed it. And the video of this modern office building falling in Gaza was really, I think, shocking to, not shocking to me, it was part of what Israel does, but I think shocking to a lot of Americans, including people in the press who were told this is where the offices of all these journalists were. And it was destroyed by Israel. You know, they don't want people reporting on this. They shot Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank, you know, on May 11th, as you pointed out. And the same day, their spokesperson said, these people are armed with cameras. I mean, what kind of idiot would say that unless that betrays some intention on their part to muzzle the press? So I think these things are shocking, and I think that they're breaking through to Americans.
Do you
And
think
oh,
the press
and
would
I'm
see that
sorry.
as 9/11?
Yeah, right.
That building coming down, they
Yeah,
had those two news
absolutely.
outlets.
Yeah. No, I should have said the 9/11 thing. It was really, it had 9/11 echo. And I'm glad you brought that up.
Is it true that there was a story a few years, I think it was a decade or so ago, that Israel was segregating black Ethiopian Jews and giving them birth control shots?
It was true that I got to be careful here because I don't remember the facts. And as a journalist, you're supposed to be concerned with facts. I am.
Yeah.
It's true that some of these Ethiopian refugees were being kept overlong in a camp in the desert. And I believe, and there was a lot of racism around there. You know, they were quote unquote Jews, they were Jewish, but they were black, and there was a lot of racism toward them in Tel Aviv and other places. And so they were subject to these kind of inhuman conditions at this camp. I think that it did include some birth control measures at some point that may have been involuntary, but I'm sorry that it's a little fuzzy for me.
What's your thoughts on General Mills divesting in Israel after years of operating a Pillsbury manufacturing facility on an illegal Israeli settlement?
Well, they said it's a business decision and they're not divesting from Israel as such. It's the West Bank, but it's great news. Anytime an American company has the wit and sense to get out of the occupied territories, it's progress. Now, I wish that they would boycott Israel as well, but as Omar Barghouti of the BDS campaign said to me several years ago, if you want to boycott an egg, we want you to boycott that egg. So I
Do you
think
hope? Oh,
these are
sorry.
important symbolic measures and moments.
Do you hope the BDS movement extends to countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey that are also committing horrible human rights abuses against their people?
I guess I do. I think that um, what's significant is when uh, civil society and human rights organizations in those countries make a call for BDS. That's to be heeded, and that's the case in the Palestine case. That a large number of Palestinian organizations have called for BDS. But yes, I don't see why it shouldn't extend to other serial violators of human rights.
There's like hundreds of countries the U.S. is giving foreign aid to that are committing human rights abuses. Israel is the biggest that we're funding.
Mhm.
When it comes to their military, that's what's really disturbing there. Zionists have gone after you personally and
Yeah.
Mondoweis for
Yes.
publishing stories on Israeli war crimes and home demolitions, and
Okay.
openly denouncing the government of Israel for doing such.
Yes.
Attorney David E. Bernstein, University professor and executive director of the Liberty and Law Center at George Mason University, referred to your publication, Mondoweis, as a hate site. How
Yes.
do you respond to David Bernstein?
Well, I haven't read his charge lately. I think
That
that
was
it
a few
was,
years back.
yes, it was. I understand. And in fairness to him, I don't know that it was about my criticism of the Israeli government. But the way I'd respond is that this is a very common. Anyone who supports Palestinian human rights has to be vilified and destroyed. Uh, that's been the rule in American politics. They have to be marginalized. You don't want people in the mainstream supporting Palestinian rights. That's what's so important about Ayman Mohadeen and Mehdi Hassan talking about Palestinian human rights on MSNBC. They're not you and me talking on a podcast. They're on a major broadcast network. And Jeff Zucker, who I forget whether he was at CNN or wherever years ago, uh, laid down the law about this stuff. I don't want to see more Palestinians screaming about Israel on the network. So he was fulminating. I forget who quoted him, but that was policy in these organizations, and that's policy politically of APAC and others of the Israel lobby. They do not want critics to get a place in American society. Israel critics to have a place, a meaningful place in the American establishment or discourse, and so they're doing everything they can to keep the squad small. Those few congresspeople who do criticize Israel, they work against them, and they make sure that others don't. They're trying to make sure that others don't join the squad from minority districts in Congress in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and other cities. So This is and the way they do this, the way they seek to marginalize such critics is to call them anti-Semites, as they've called me anti-Semitic and called Mondoweiss a hate site. I think that that's fading over the years, just as people understand, look, what do they care about at Mondoweiss? They care about Palestinian human rights.
Is Gaza still having its water and electric rationed by the Israeli government?
I believe it is, yes, definitely. It's having its water and electricity rationed, and that's because of the occupying authority, the fact that Israel occupies Gaza.
How do Americans go about advocating for a lasting peace between Israel and Palestine to end the occupation?
I would tell them to inform themselves first. Don't go off half-cocked, because people take you on, and you should know what you're talking about. Inform yourself, and then they should support Palestinian human rights. They should do what people did in the Jim Crow South years ago, when they tried to end the struggles there, or when they tried to end the struggles in South Africa, political struggles. They supported the rights of Black people, political rights of Black people. So they should support Palestinian political and human rights. And that's the only way this conflict will be resolved, is when Palestinians have such rights in whatever national entity emerges from this conflict.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about Mondoweis that I didn't cover?
They should read Mondoweiss, because we try to publicize these issues. We try to cover them and do it thoroughly.
A lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis is possible if more Americans look beyond Zionist propaganda and lift up their voices in solidarity and demand action from Congress and the President. That action should equate to no more foreign aid to Israel until the occupation ends and either a peaceful one-state or two-state solution is had. It's not for me or any American to say what that ultimate end goal for the Palestinians should be. That should be solely up to the Palestinians. The U.S. government should not be giving foreign aid to any country committing human rights abuses and or war crimes against their own people, occupants, or neighbors, and we ourselves should not be using our military to start or enter unjust wars. Besides the carnage involved, the fighting going on between the Israelis and Palestinians is helping to fuel the whole Armageddon delusion among fundamentalist Christians in the United States, keeping them distracted on divisive social issues instead of taking better care of themselves and their families. If peace is brokered between Palestinians and Israelis, that imagery fades, and the fanatics in power in our country lose that power at the polls and over our elected officials. So every American should be demanding a lasting peace between these two peoples. If you want to learn more about the Palestinian-Israeli Nightmare, check out Mondoweiss's website at mondoweiss.net. I want to thank my special guest, Philip Weiss, for providing insight into the plight of the Palestinians. It's a tragedy the mainstream media rarely reports on the occupation from the perspective of the Palestinians. That has got to change, especially with the Israeli government murdering journalists like they do. For Mothman and the Bible Belt podcast outlet updates, guest bios, and direct links to social media, please check out mothmanandthebiblebelt.com. Thanks for listening!